policy crime that is unconstitutional towards the entire nation. It would effectively make it impossible to challenge the federal government on anything. Where's the statements? Hearing arguments. Okay, that was the same article that I was just on. Where were their statements? Give me their statements. Court's liberal justices seem firmly in support of the lower court rulings. Of course. If the government wins on today's arguments, it could still enforce the order against people who haven't sued, Kagan said. All of those individuals are going to win, and the ones who can't afford to go to court, they're the ones who are going to lose. You have to sue the government to keep them from violating your rights. It would literally be incomprehensibly cucked of SCOTUS to say injunctions aren't allowed. It would also be, how do I put this? It would be extremely authoritarian, but also in a way that's completely non-functional. Because this would mean, like, I want you to imagine this in any other context. Like any country where the government, by rule, violates its own constitution openly, constantly against millions of people. And you can beat them if you just sue them and have the money to do so. But if you don't, you get the shit end of the stick no matter what. All court systems are permanently bogged down by the millions and millions and millions of cases against the government, money funneling into the state and lawyers as everyone tries to be, one of the lucky ones who get to personally sue for their own constitutionally protected rights. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. I can't think of any other country that works like this. It's like a broken system. It doesn't function. It's a non-functioning system. So, of course, it's what they want. When can we expect to hear a ruling? A decision is expected by the end of June. So, we'll hear. We'll hear soon. Let me see if I can find some excerpts from the transcript. Supreme Court nationwide injunction arguments. Quotes. The Supreme Court on Thursday seemed open to lifting a series of nationwide orders blocking Trump from enforcing his birthright citizenship policy, even as several of the justices wrestled with the practical implications of allowing the government to deny citizenship to people born in the U.S. and of limiting nationwide injunctions. If there's one thing that I truly, truly hate about the Supreme Court, it's how rules lawyery there are about things that you don't need to be a rules lawyer over. The claim being made by the Supreme Court, by the Trump administration is absolutely psychotic. It doesn't work. Justice Neil Gorsuch at one point ruminated about the patchwork problems of allowing enforcement in some parts of the country but not others. Jesus Christ. The musing over it, will we issue a decision that breaks the country? This shouldn't even be in front of SCOTUS. It's so open and shut. Well, normally procedural stuff like this, questions over procedure, they don't make it to the Supreme Court. This is pretty unusual, like at the face of it, Normally the Supreme Court talks more about the substance of an issue, like what's the underlying argument. In this case, they're just talking about, like, essentially the nationwide injunction element. The fact that it's about birthright citizenship is almost incidental. Kavanaugh, a member of the conservative wing who sometimes sides with the liberals, suggested that class action lawsuits would suffice for allowing the challengers to Trump's executive order to get broad relief from the courts. He brushed away the suggestion from challengers that relying on class certification as a tool raises many of the same issues as nationwide injunctions the president is complaining about. That's great. That's good. The Trump administration has pointed to class action lawsuits as being the proper vehicle for courts to issue orders that would broadly block enforcement of unlawful presidential policy while the issue travels up higher courts. But liberal justices on Thursday and conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett grilled Solicitor General D. John Sauer on the possibility that the administration would even fight in court against a request for class certification in this case. Oh, it's grim. The court's three liberals battered Sauer with questions about how rolling back nationwide injunctions would work in practice. They quickly sought to move the debate beyond the Trump administration's assertion that its request was a modest one, dealing with the technical issue of limiting the reach of nationwide injunctions. The president is violating not just one, but at my count, 4 established Supreme Court precedents, said Justice Sonia Sotomayor to Sauer. And you are claiming that both the Supreme Court and no lower court can stop an executive universally from violating those holdings. Let's just assume you're dead wrong. Justice Elena Kagan said at one point, does every single person that is affected by this EO have to bring their own suit? Are there alternatives? How long does it take? How do we get to the result that there is a single rule of citizenship that is a rule that we've historically applied rather than the rule the EO would have us do? The court's conservatives engaged with that discussion less, but several nonetheless raised the issue. Notably, Kavanaugh pushed Sauer on how hospitals and states would deal with the order if it were allowed to be implemented tomorrow. On the day after it goes into effect, this is a very practical question. How it's going to work? What do hospitals do with a newborn? Kavanaugh asked. Sauer said that federal officials would have to figure out the implementation. How? Kavanaugh demanded. So you can imagine a number of ways that the federal officials could, Sauer said, such as, Kavanaugh continued, seemingly skeptical. Wait, complete the statement. Give me the audio.
Things can happen that need to happen for 30 days or some period of time, or should we not even worry about that?
Yes, we can see that the 30-day ramp-up period that the executive order itself calls for never started because the universal TROs were entered almost immediately, and we don't dispute that there should be a 30-day ramp-up period. For another reason as well, which is that we've been enjoined from even doing guidance, even formulating a policy, and that itself is another problem with these injunctions.
On the day after it goes into effect, this is just a very practical question how this is going to work. What do hospitals do with a newborn? What do states do with a newborn?
What the executive says in Section 2 is that federal officials do not accept documents that have the wrong designation of citizenship from people who are subject to the executive order.
How are they going to know that?
The states can continue to, the federal officials will have to figure that out.
How?
So you could imagine a number of ways that the federal officials could.
Such as?
Such as they could require a showing of, documentation showing legal presence in the country. For a temporary visitor, for example, they could see whether they're on a B-1 visa, which would exclude kind of the birthright citizenship in that country.
For all the newborns? Is that how that's going to work?
Again, we don't know because the agencies were never given the opportunity to formulate the guidance.
So, for one, you could have formulated the guidance even with the injunction out, you stupid piece of shit. Second of all, what D. John Sauer, U.S. Solicitor General, is saying essentially is that for every single newborn currently held in a hospital who hasn't yet been presented with all of its documentation and paperwork, all of the parents of those kids would need to bring their like proof of citizenship to prove that that at least one of them is a U.S. citizen, so that they wouldn't be subject to the birthright citizenship ending executive order. And if they don't do so, if they can't prove that, effectively that would be a stateless baby. Like that baby would essentially be condemned to a life of wretched misery anywhere in the world. I mean, unless they could be granted citizenship for a different country, but that's not necessarily guaranteed, like, at all.
They're only going to have 30 days to do this. You think they can get it together in time?
They're under, that's what the executive order instructs them to do, and hopefully they will do so. Again, it's a speculative and hypothetical scenario because they were enjoined from even starting that process.
Also, the argument that he is making to the Supreme Court of the United States when asked a very, very basic question about what the effect of an executive order would be if it was implemented is, well, we haven't written on its implementation yet because we weren't given the chance to when he signed the executive order. So they're essentially saying not only did he sign the executive order with no plan whatsoever on implementation, but we still haven't produced one. And the only reason we haven't produced one is because the injunction somehow prevented us from creating the documentation should it ever be allowed through. They have no plans. They don't care. They wrote the EO. They told ChatGPT to write the EO, and that's it.
And then last question. You mentioned before this has come up in the last 4 or 5 administrations primarily. I guess I've thought about that a lot too. Why? It seems why might be it's harder to get legislation through Congress, particularly with the filibuster rule. Presidents want to get things done with good intentions. The executive branches that work for those presidents push hard to, when they can't get new authority, to stretch or use existing authority, and they've been pushing, understandably, all with good intentions, all the presidents, both parties, right, with good intentions, pushing. Is that your understanding of why this has happened more, that there's less ability to get legislation? Because I'm trying to figure out the why to your opening about the last 4 or 5 administrations. I agree with it. I think that might be the why, but I'm curious what you think.
I'm speculating about the motivations of the individual district judges